All right, welcome everyone. This session will be about ADFS, but also about SharePoint, of course. So a quick look at our sponsors. You've probably seen them by now. But okay, a little bit about myself. I'm Thomas Vochten. I'm a SharePoint MVP based out of Belgium. I fiddle around with SharePoint. I'm an infrastructure guy. And well, I also would like to play with SQL Server a lot. So that's mainly my focus when I present. It's always about SharePoint, of course, because of my SharePoint Server MVP, and also about SQL Server and working SQL Server and SharePoint together. But today we're talking ADFS. You can reach me on Twitter. I'm a fairly active Twitterer, and you can also go to my blog. The slides will be up there at the end of the session. So, but I'm sure that the organization will publish the slides also somewhere on their website. Okay, what are we going to talk about today? We can't talk about ADFS without giving you a short primer on claims-based identity. For many people that might be already old school or old news, but well, ADFS without talking about claims, that's not possible. Then I'm going to explain you how to configure ADFS. There are many videos on the internet that show you, well, the next finish way. I'm going to do more or less the same, but afterwards I'll try to explain you what they don't tell you when you implement ADFS for the first time. When you go to TechNet and you see videos, okay, it's a bit of PowerShell, you just click in central administration and you're done. But then the real project work starts, and then there are some little things that you discover that they didn't tell you before, and I'm going to try to at least uncover some of these difficulties. So after we've configured ADFS, we're going to set up SharePoint. Well, not setting up SharePoint, but SharePoint to work with ADFS. And then I'm going to show you, we're going over some challenges that you might encounter in a real-world project. But first we have to talk about claims. Claims-based identity in a nutshell. And in claims world, it all boils down to trust. Who do you trust? And it's important to understand that trust is not always limited to the technical capability. For example, we can configure SharePoint to connect to Active Directory. We can connect SharePoint to some other directory service. But it boils down to, okay, who does SharePoint trust? And that's always or almost based on the context. The typical example when using claims-based authentication is that when you get stopped by the police, they ask your driver's license. Well, in Belgium they do. I hope they do in Sweden. So they ask your driver's license, and in my case, it says that I'm a male of 39 years old. Okay, that's the context. But you might go on Facebook and you might pretend that you're a, let's say, 18-year-old girl. That's also context. So it depends on who you trust. And for example, you can log into websites with Facebook. You can log into websites with Twitter, and it's all different identities and all different contexts. And that's what I'm about to show you. So claims-based identity is not a new concept. We've seen claims-based systems for a long time. In fact, Windows authentication itself is probably a claims-based system. Kerberos, for example, you might consider that to be some kind of claims-based identity system. And what claims do is they provide abstraction from the actual implementation of an identity. For example, we will see that if we configure SharePoint to talk to ADFS, SharePoint doesn't know where you're coming from. SharePoint doesn't know anymore that you're really in Active Directory or that you're in Oracle Identity Manager or in some other directory. If your username is validated in a text file, perhaps, that's all possible. So claims abstracts your identity away from SharePoint and provides your identity to SharePoint in a unified way. When we're talking about claims, it's also important to know the difference between authentication and authorization. SharePoint never does authentication, never. It always passes on this task to another system. In this case, or in our case today, that's ADFS. But the authorization part, granting users access to something or configuring rights, that is done in SharePoint. So it's important to differentiate between these two concepts. And authorization decisions are based on claims. So if I have my driver's license and I claim to be 39 years old and a male, okay, that entitles me to drive my car. That's a difference. Some claims examples. Well, we've got the obvious ones, your name, in SharePoint, your email address perhaps, or your social security number. Your group memberships can also be used to, as a claim. Your user account himself, a booking reference. If you subscribe to the SharePoint Saturday, you probably received an email. That is also a claim. Who you are, and that provides authorization to enter the venue. Your employment status, for example. There are a lot of possible claims. Now, after you've been authenticated, the authorization process is there. And in SharePoint and in Windows and in most computer systems, the authorization is based on a token. Remember, in SharePoint 2007 and also in 2010, most of the people used classic mode authentication. And classic mode authentication means that SharePoint, or that your user, provides a Windows token to SharePoint to do the actual authorization. In 2010, we already had claims mode authentication, but most of the people, or most customers I know, still use classic mode authentication. And in SharePoint 2013, classic mode is still possible, but it's deprecated. You shouldn't use it. And if you're starting on with a SharePoint 2013 project, you probably should do claims. In fact, when you used claims in SharePoint 2010, there were a lot of things that didn't work. But if you don't use claims in SharePoint 2013, there are also some things that don't work. That's very important. So claims mode authentication is the default in SharePoint 2013. If you create a new web application in SharePoint 2013, you can't choose classic mode anymore. You have to do it via PowerShell. And even then there's a warning not to do it or to really think about it. In some migration scenarios that might be handy, however. Now a claims token, how does it look like? Well, more or less. It's a collection of claims. For example, your username. In my examples, we're going to use the user principal name from Active Directory because, well, that should be unique. Normally, there is only one single user, one single UPN that is unique for every user. But we can also use a list of Windows groups that you're part of to make the authorization decisions. That's also a claim. And you can also pick and choose other ones, like your email address. And essential for these tokens, so the group of claims, that they're signed. And that's the trust part. Because if we connect SharePoint at ADFS, it's just based on a URL. So if you go to SharePoint, SharePoint says, oh, I don't know you. Go to this other place, and that's ADFS to authenticate, and it redirects you. But the response that it gets back, well, SharePoint has to be sure that it's coming from the right ADFS server. So every claims token is signed with a certificate. That is also essential in configuring this trust. Yeah, those are some examples. When you're talking with identity people, I'm not really an identity guy, but the real identity people, there are all kinds of buzzwords flying around, and it's not always very clear what they mean. Things like, well, claim, that is obvious, but security tokens, identity providers, relying parties, security token services, and realms, all kinds of strange words that you might not be familiar with. So we discussed claims and security tokens. Now we've got the identity provider. For SharePoint, the identity provider is ADFS. That's the one that hands out the claims. That's the identity provider. Then we've got the relying party, and relying party is what SharePoint is to ADFS. So the identity provider is ADFS to SharePoint, and relying party is SharePoint to ADFS. If ADFS hands out claims to the user, they're sent to the relying party. And the security token service is also ADFS, and that is a service that creates the security tokens, signs them, and does all the authentication security checking. A realm, that's something very special. A realm is a way of configuring ADFS so that ADFS knows when your request from SharePoint arrives at ADFS, that ADFS knows which configuration to load. Because you might have 10 SharePoint farms that all connected to the same ADFS farm, and ADFS has to have a way to know, okay, which configuration do I load? And it's not only SharePoint applications that can be configured in ADFS, but also other applications, and you want to make sure that you have the right configuration. That's the ROM. We will come back to ROMs in a few slides. If you decide to go with claims in SharePoint 2013, there are three types of claims that you can use. The first is Windows claims. That's more or less like classic authentication, but the token is converted to a claims token. But from a functional perspective for the user, everything remains the same. So if the user logs into SharePoint, he won't see any difference. The username is the same, etc. Everything works as usual. That's the Windows claims. We've got trusted provider claims. They're also called SAML claims. SAML, that means security, assertion, markup language. It's a standard to do claims-based authentication. And that is what we are going to use if we configure ADFS. So if you heard the term SAMLs or SAML tokens, or that means that we are going to use ADFS or another identity provider, because there are other providers on the market. A third way of using claims in SharePoint 2013 is forms-based authentication. If you use forms-based authentication, you have to use claims. Otherwise, it doesn't work. You can't configure it. From SharePoint 2010 on, it was possible to configure multiple authentication providers on the same zone. Before, with SharePoint 2007, that was not possible. You had one zone for Windows authentication, one zone for forms-based authentication, one for something else. And starting from 2010, you could have multiple providers in the same zone. And it provides you a little menu that you can choose from. I want to log into SharePoint with Windows, or I want to log into SharePoint with forms-based authentication. And the classic mode is only via PowerShell. Okay, but no matter what claims authentication you choose, what kind of method you choose, in the end, everything is normalized into an SP user object. So from a development point of view, for example, normally if you follow the right procedures, it doesn't matter if your user is coming from SAML claims or Windows tokens, or doesn't matter. So everything, no matter what you use, even if you use other ones, they are normalized into an SP user object. And inside of SharePoint, even if you use classic authentication, it still uses SAML tokens internally. That was also true in SharePoint 2010. So under the covers, it's claims-based authentication no matter what you configure. So Windows claims, you might think that all this claims-based authentication, Kerberos is dead. Because one of the aims of one of the benefits of claims-based authentication is that we can do things like single sign-on. But Kerberos, in a way, is also single sign-on for Windows authentication. It's not because we have claims that we can't use Kerberos anymore. There are a lot of scenarios that we have to use Kerberos, and that we can't use these SAML claims. It's very fancy, but not all backend systems support this. So Kerberos and Windows claims also provide single sign-on. There is a service, the Claims to Windows Token service, that you can use to convert Windows claims to Windows identities for the outside world. But that's a completely other story. That is a session of, well, at least 2 hours. So I won't bother you with that. Spence Harbor has a really good session on Claims to Windows Token service. It's probably somewhere on the internet. Then these trusted provider claims, the SAML claims, the ADFS claims that we are going to use. In our case, we configure SharePoint to be a relying party. So ADFS will send claims to SharePoint, and you always need an external identity provider to use these SAML claims in SharePoint. So today we're using ADFS. And it's based on standards, not only SAML, but there's a series of protocols that define the standard, how these servers talk to each other, how the claims token is put together, etc. It's very interesting literature, but, well, if you want to fall asleep, perhaps, it's rather nasty. What you will see when you log on with trusted provider claims or SAML claims is that the browser will do a whole kind of series of redirects. You might notice from logging into websites with Twitter, for example. You go to a website, you say, okay, I want to log in. It redirects to Twitter, you sign in, and you go back, etc. So it's browser redirects, and that's more or less how it works. I shamelessly copied this animation from John Craddock. It's a famous British identity guy. Active Directory, a certified master, etc. So he really knows his stuff. I couldn't do this better. So, when your user wants to go to SharePoint, he will request a claims token at the identity provider, at ADFS. ADFS will then check the credentials in Active Directory and will create a token. Now, authenticates the user. You can put in your username and password, or it can be a transparent logon with Windows, like we will do in our example. And then this identity provider, ADFS, creates a security token. It puts all your claims in it, it signs it, and then your browser, via a cookie, will send this token to SharePoint. SharePoint will accept the token, will decrypt it, or will verify the signature. It's not really encrypted. Will verify the signature, and then, based on this token, extracts your claims and does its necessary authorization decisions. Okay. ADFS it's cool and all, but what do we do with it? What are the usage scenarios or the use cases that we might use ADFS for? The most obvious one is cloud, of course. If you were in Samasani's session, I don't know if he's in the room, no? If you want to configure a hybrid environment, for example, or you want to connect your local Active Directory to the cloud, you need ADFS. So that's one of the main use cases. For extranets, we've got a big customer that uses ADFS to authenticate its extranet users. You've got an internal Active Directory, you've got an Active Directory in your DMZ, and then your external users can log on to the environment using the Active Directory in the DMZ. It's even possible, and that's called federation, to use your own Active Directory to connect to a remote resource. So for mergers and acquisitions, it's also used. For example, in the old days, well, we still do it, but in the old days, we configure domain trusts between Active Directory forests, for example. That is still valid, but it has some limitations. And one of the ways that we see ADFS is being used is because, well, you can now create federation between two directories instead of creating a real Windows claim. The benefit, for example, is firewall ports. It's much more extensible. You can do trusts across the internet. Try doing that with classic Windows trusts. That's not possible. And advanced identity scenarios like federation, that is what we'll cover in the next graphic, also from John Craddock. Don't tell him. This is an advanced scenario. This is not what we're going to do today in my demo. It shows you how you can federate different identity providers. For example, like the extranet, you've got an internal Active Directory, you've got an external Active Directory in your DMZ or somewhere else, and you want users, both your employees and your partner users, to connect to the same resource, to SharePoint. So what happens? This is a partner user, so someone outside of your company who has a user account in your Active Directory in your DMZ. He will go to SharePoint. That's your claims-aware application. That's SharePoint. SharePoint will say, okay, welcome, but I don't know you. Access denied. Please go somewhere else to authenticate. Okay, you're not authenticated. And you're redirected in the browser. The URL will change to the ADFS server. And the ADFS server will say, okay, welcome, but you seem to be a partner user. You don't belong to my company. I will send you to again, another party who might know your identity. So we'll say, okay, that's called home run discovery. That means, okay, where does the user come from? Is it an internal user or an external user? And then the user is redirected to another ADFS server. And that's typically the ADFS server of the partner itself. And the ADFS server of the partner itself is connected to its own Active Directory, and he can verify the username and password. Then this ADFS server creates a security token, sends it back to the partner user in a browser, in a cookie, which in turn sends it back to your ADFS server. who repackages the security token, creates another one, and sends it back to the user. So you see, it's a whole bunch of redirects in the browser. And if you open this authentication process with Fiddler, for example, or one of these tools, you will see a lot of redirects, a lot of cookies passing in the browser. But that's the more advanced scenario. Today we are going to cover configuring this trust, the trust between SharePoint and ADFS server. We're not going to do the advanced federation stuff, otherwise we'll be here at 5 o'clock. Okay. So, ADFS and SharePoint. There are other solutions on the market. Before we start with ADFS, these are some examples. CA has one, SiteMinder. It's widely used. Shibboleth, Oracle Access Manager, Tivoli Access Manager, all kinds of nice solutions. And they all support the same standards. So in the previous graphic, the second authentication provider, that could be an Oracle, ADFS talking to Oracle, for example. And you can also build your own solutions using WIF, that's Windows Identity Foundation, if you want to build your own ADFS, but I wouldn't recommend that. It's possible, though. Why would we use ADFS? Well, it's a natural candidate for SharePoint. Why? Because it's made by Microsoft. That's logical. It's fully supported. Connecting SharePoint to ADFS is supported and documented on TechNet, so that's the most natural candidate. But you can federate SharePoint with other identity providers. That would not be a problem if you know the right settings and how to configure the right standards. ADFS is also nice because it integrates automatically with Active Directory. ADFS stands for Active Directory Federation Services, but well, it's probably not a really good name, in my opinion, because you can use ADFS to connect to a SQL database to authenticate, for example. That stores your username and password. But well, it's called Active Directory Federation Service, but it doesn't need to use Active Directory to do the authentication. It's also often used as a go-between. I've got some customers who use Oracle Access Manager to store, or SAP, for example, to store all their credentials. And it's more or less, it's easier to configure SharePoint to use ADFS than it's to configure SharePoint to talk to Oracle Access Manager. So it's often used as a go-between between SharePoint and another system. And this is also an important one. It's free. And Oracle Access Manager costs a lot of money. So if you install Windows Server, you can, if you use an older Windows version, download ADFS for free. And if you've got Windows Server 2008 or 2 or Windows Server 2012, the right version to connect to SharePoint is already included in the product. There is a nice TechNet wiki about ADFS. The URL will be in the slides. So if you want to have more information about ADFS, that's where you can go. Okay, this is just for reference. It's the same process that I already explained. All these redirects and all the authentication steps are in it. That's if you download the slides afterwards, but it's more or less the same as the first graphic that I showed you. Okay, how can you install ADFS? If you're using Windows Server 2008 or 2, you have to download ADFS. It's a free download. Be very careful because Windows Server 2008 or 2, Windows Server 2008 has an ADFS version as a feature available, but that's the wrong version. It doesn't work or is not supported with SharePoint. So always download ADFS 2.0. When you have Windows Server 2012, you don't have to download anything because it's included in the product as a feature. And you can do it in the user interface, but well, it's just one single line of PowerShell to install ADFS on your server. And it's already present, so install Windows feature, ADFS Federation, and well, include management tools if you actually want to manage it. You can install ADFS in different configurations. For testing purposes or really small implementations, you can use it. You can install it next finish, and then it installs a Windows internal database. But you can also create large ADFS farms with redundancy, high availability, and then you would need SQL Server to have a common configuration database like SharePoint. After you have installed ADFS, it's just a matter of running a wizard to get it running. It's also a configuration wizard. Two things are important to specify. First is this SSL certificates, because ADFS does not work without using SSL. Also in SharePoint, don't bother trying to use SharePoint web application without HTTPS. It won't work together with ADFS. So always use SSL everywhere if you want to use ADFS. And then, very important, you have to provide a federation server name, and that is going to be used as a URL. In my case, or here, it's federation.lab. And my domain name. But that's very important because that's the URL SharePoint will send the users to in the first redirect. So if you're exposing your SharePoint farm to the internet, make sure that this URL is routable on the internet. So, and the problem is, the problem is that SharePoint can only talk to one ADFS server and one URL. So you can't specify an internal URL to the ADFS and an external URL. You always have to use the same. So be sure to also internally use a routable TNS entry. Okay, after we've installed ADFS, that's really next finish, it's really simple. We have to do some basic things. First, we have to export the token signing certificate. Remember, in the beginning of my presentation, you've got this claims token, and it's signed. That's this certificate. By default, ADFS creates this token itself. It's a self-signed certificate. In a real environment, you might want to use a domain signed or something along those lines. But you have to export this because SharePoint does need this certificate to validate the tokens. So you have to export them. Then you have to configure SharePoint as a relying party to ADFS. Tell ADFS, okay, I've got this SharePoint system that I want to connect to. And what are the claims that we are going to send to SharePoint? That's the second step. And that's the third step. That's configuring the claims that we are going to use. All right. I'll quickly show you how that's done. I've got some machines running here. And I'll start on my ADFS server. Just a few machines. It's already installed because installing ADFS is not really interesting. This is the ADFS management console. And we want to configure ADFS to have a trust to SharePoint. So we go to trust relationships. Can you see that in the back? I suppose so, yeah. Not a big room. And now we go to relying party trusts because SharePoint will be a relying party to SharePoint. And then we're going to add a relying party trust. Again, a wizard. It's Microsoft. You can also do this in PowerShell. If you configure ADFS for Office 365, for example, that's all done for you with PowerShell. But we're going to do it manually. So we're going to enter the data about the relying party manually. Now we're going to give it a name. I typically take the name of the SharePoint farm. Something like this. SharePoint Saturday Stockholm. Then you have to choose what kind of ADFS features you want to use. We're going to use the standard one, which uses the SAML 2.0 protocol. And then you ask for an optional token encryption certificate. We're not going to use this, or typically we don't use this with SharePoint, because the token itself will be signed, but the connection between ADFS and the user and SharePoint is all done over SSL. So we don't need this step. So we don't have to encrypt the tokens themselves because the traffic is already secured. SharePoint, because there are different standards, SharePoint only supports WS Federation. That's a passive protocol. Why is it called passive? Because everything is done in the browser. There is no actual active traffic between ADFS and SharePoint. It's always the browser talking to SharePoint, the browser talking to ADFS, and vice versa. There is no direct communication necessary even between ADFS and SharePoint. So that's why it's called passive. Then we have to specify an endpoint. And that is typically the URL of the SharePoint web application. So that's SPS STHLM. Make sure you don't make typos because otherwise it will horribly fail. And when configuring ADFS with SharePoint, it almost never works the first time in my experience. So there's always some kind of typo somewhere, a slash, or it's very critical to have it just right. So I wouldn't be surprised if it fails miserably in a few minutes, but then we know where to look. And this is a critical part. At the end of the URL, of the web application URL, you append _trust. In the _trust virtual directory in IIS, that's the endpoint that the user has to be sent to that knows about the trusted provider claims. So always append _trust, and the last slash is also needed. Let's verify URL again. SPS, STHLM. Okay, I hope it's right. Then you have to specify an identifier. That's the realm, or the realm I talked about. Because you can have multiple relying parties in ADFS, and we have to tell ADFS which SharePoint server we're talking about. By default, there is already this URL, but typically we specify another one. And that always takes the form like this. It's a convention. URN, and then an identifier, like SharePoint, and then again something. But it can be more or less anything that you want, but this is a convention. SPS, STHLM. Okay. I could have chosen something more easy, but okay. And then we say, okay, everyone from our Active Directory or from our user directory can use this connection. Okay, and then we're done. There are all kinds of other settings that you can specify, but typically with SharePoint we don't do this. So we say next, and close. And then we will open the claim rules window. And in the claim rules window, we can specify which claims we are going to send to SharePoint. And based on these claims, SharePoint can make authorization decisions. There are many possibilities, but we are going to send attributes from Active Directory. You give it a name, AD, rules, for example. All those claims are coming from Active Directory. And then there's a large list of possible properties from Active Directory. In my case, I will take the user principal name. That's the most important one. And in the claim, that will be UPN. I will take the email address. And it's just a mapping that we create now. And I will take the Windows groups that the user is part of. And ADFS, that is called token groups unqualified names. And unqualified names, that means just the name of the group, not the underlying SID that we normally use in Windows. That's why it's unqualified. You will see later on why we use it without an SID. And that will be our role claim. So UPN, email address, and role, those are the claims that we are going to provide to SharePoint. And based on UPN, email address, or role, you can make authorization decisions inside of SharePoint. Okay, that's done. So now we've configured ADFS. And now we have to configure SharePoint. That's something else. So what we have to do is import the token signing certificate that we exported just a minute ago. Well, we didn't do it, but I did it before. And then we are going to create a trusted security token issuer. That's a mouthful, but it means a connection to ADFS, basically. And then we are going to configure our web applications to actually use ADFS and not with the Windows claims. And then we're going to give ourselves permissions. This is the PowerShell that we use. So we import the token signing certificate from ADFS into SharePoint. And then we define our three claims. We've got the email address, the role, and the UPN. Now, there is some kind of syntax for each claim that is based on standards or conventions that we use. And if you have your own claims, because that's also possible, you can just, well, invent something, basically. And these are the names of the claims on how we are going to use them inside of SharePoint. Email address, role, and UPN. Those are the three claims that we configured earlier. Then we are going to specify the realm. So that's the one that we specified earlier. URN SharePoint Saturday Stockholm. Because if SharePoint is making a connection to ADFS, it has to know which configuration to load. Then we also say, okay, if a user comes to SharePoint and it's received an access denied, redirect the users to this URL. And that's the URL of my ADFS server. And for ADFS, it's always /ADFS/ls. That's also a convention. And then we tie it all together in creating a new SP Trusted Identity Token Issuer. It's a mouthful. After we've done that, we go to our web applications and we want to change the authentication provider. So in central administration, we go to web applications, we click authentication providers, and when we configure the trusted token issuer with PowerShell, there is a new entry created here, and we say we don't use Windows authentication anymore, we use this other thing, this ADFS thing. That's the third step. Right, let's go to SharePoint. I've got my PowerShell already here. This is the exact same PowerShell that I showed you on the screen. So we are going to import the certificate into SharePoint. We're going to define the 3 claims that we accept from ADFS: email, role, and UPN. And one of the essential switches here, okay. Then we create the ROM, so ADFS knows who we are. We tell them, okay, this is the URL that users have to use to sign in. And then we create our connection to ADFS. We tie all these variables together to make this connection. Okay. In here is a very important property. That's the identifier claim. That's the unique identifier of our user. In classic mode, or in Windows claims, that's domain name /username. And in ADFS, that will be our UPN. So if you log on to SharePoint, your user will be identified by your user principal name from Active Directory. Okay, we've now configured the connection. Now we have to change our web applications. Because I've got 2 web applications. This is my portal web application, and I've got a my site. And this now it uses Windows authentication, but we'll use SAML authentication or ADFS authentication now. So we go to central administration, we go to authentication providers, we click the zone. I've got only one zone, and this screen I suppose everyone is familiar with. When I created my web application, I was planning on using NTLM, Windows authentication, but because of a PowerShell command, there is a new entry here. A trusted identity provider, and that's the one we are going to use right now. Okay, so we don't use Windows anymore. There is a warning that we will talk about later on. And we are going to use ADFS. So I choose trusted identity provider and ADFS. And I now click OK. Now the problem now is that it will change some IIS configuration files, so we have to wait a few seconds. And afterwards we are going to do the same thing for the My Sites web application. So both web applications will redirect us to ADFS to do the authentication. And always take some more time when you're doing it in front of a live audience. That's the demo gods, always against us. Come on. And you know how in SharePoint you always have these nice friendly error messages or working on it messages, but SharePoint really lets us down now. No visual indication, no spinning icon. You know, one of the nicest features in SharePoint since 2010, if you have the spinning icon from working on it, you can click on it and then it disappears. You might try that. I always thought that there was some kind of intern in Microsoft that they had nothing to do for, and they say, well, oh yeah, there's a spinning icon we want. Well, do something fancy with it. And even if you go over the spinning icon, he says it in a little box, click here to dismiss this animation or something like that. But even that stupid joke wasn't enough to cover the timeout. Okay. So, and to make things worse is we now have to do the same thing for the other web application. So perhaps that's a good time to do some questions if you've got a question. Or have you fallen asleep yet? No. It was a nice lunch, however. Save, and wait again.
Thomas, what's the default behavior of token expiration?
Ah, yeah, that's a very interesting one. Token expiration, well, because ADFS is all based on cookies. And all these cookies have an expiration date or expiration time. And the standard is a few hours. I don't recall exactly how many hours. And there is a sliding window. So when you approach the end of the validation time of this of the expiration date, he will request a new cookie, and the session will keep on working. That's a theory, because in reality, there's always some messing around with cookie lifetime, and yeah. And then you've got two cookies. You've got session cookies and persistent cookies, and you might be tempted to use persistent cookies if things don't work, or to use session cookies because the default is persisting cookies. But then the Office client integration doesn't work anymore. So that's a bit of a problem.
Because it can be really problematic.
Yes, yeah. It depends on the requirements of the customer, because the default behavior is you've got this cookie that you received from ADFS that is stored in your browser. The next time, it just takes this cookie and you're in.
Yeah.
It's not going to do the validation anymore until the expiration is done. So for some customers, that might be unacceptable, because that's not really secure. What if someone hijacks the cookie, and that can be problematic, yeah. That's one of the challenges if I still have got time, I'm planning to talk about. But there is no easy answer. It's the standard consultant's answer. It depends. So, what did I do? Okay, now we've got the two web applications. I'll try to open them. Again, some waiting. It's still SharePoint. It's still ASP.NET. Everything has to warm up. Don't you hate this, the warm-up stuff? Long live just-in-time compilation. I hate it. It's always bad for SharePoint, because people think, SharePoint is slow, and then you forget to create a warm-up script as an administrator. It's horrible. Okay, what is happening now? We are entering our web application, and you see that the URL is not a web application, but it's ADFS. So it has already done its first redirect. And if it will fail now, normally. ADFS is also ASP.NET, it also has to warm up. Oh, much to my surprise, it works. Now you might not notice any differences. That's normal. That's supposed to be error. Fantastic. Yeah. Okay. But that's one of the other challenges, why the second web application doesn't work. It's because we didn't identify the second web application to ADFS. Well, it works. Okay. Now I must admit I did something behind the scenes before we started, is that I granted my user full control to this web application. Because what happens when you change your authentication from Windows authentication to SAML authentication, your username changes. Before it was domain/username, and afterwards it's your user principal name. Now I've got this web part. It's a claims viewer web part. And I'm by no means a developer, so I did not create this myself. But it's a web part that identifies all the claims and everything that is in your claims token. You can download a lot of these web parts from Codeplex, for example. There's a very nice one. So what we have here is my name identifier claim. You see, it's not domain name /username. It's spadmin@lab.thvo.net. That's my user principal name. So that's the identity I'm using to connect to SharePoint, and not my classic Windows token anymore. So what I did is I went to central administration, and I went to user policy, and I added my user principal name to it. You see, spadmin here. And if I wouldn't have done this, I would have an access denied after we configured ADFS. Now that's normal behavior because it always takes time. And you see, this is my username now. See, I0ET ADFS, etc., etc. So that's my new username. Well, okay, so it works. Now, what happens if we click on the My Site application? Let's go to our news feed. Oh, it gave an error before, but you notice what happened? I just arrived at the same web application. That's because ADFS doesn't know about the My Site application. We now have to tell ADFS that there is another web application that is also using ADFS. Because if we create this trusted identity issuer with PowerShell, we only tell it about my main web application. And that's why it will fail. That's one of the first things you encounter when you activate ADFS, because no one tells you that you have to add your second web application. Okay, but it works, nice. And we've got a whole lot of claims. Yes, sorry.
That's about all the web applications that you have.
Yes, yes. And okay, you might know that we are supposed to use hostname site collections right now. Well, supposed to use, well, it's a sort of a good practice to use them. And then the problem is that you have to create an entry in ADFS for each hostname site collection. So if you've got an automatic provisioning process to create those hostname site collections, you've got to include some kind of API or some kind of hook to ADFS to also create a relying party in ADFS like we did the first time for our application. So if you've got 1,000 hostname site collections, you've got to create 1,000 relying parties in ADFS. That's something to keep in mind. Okay, what are those challenges? It's still SharePoint. So keep calm. Almost every issue that you encounter with ADFS is documented somewhere, not all in my PowerPoint slide. But the one I didn't tell you about yet is the most noticeable functional difference, is that the people picker doesn't work anymore. Because all those standards, they define how the connection between SharePoint and ADFS should be configured. But because because all the identities are abstracted away from SharePoint, like I told you, SharePoint does not have a clue where the identities are coming from. So if you open the people picker, that's the people picker, or the share functionality that I also hate, but okay. If you type anything to here, for example, this is not valid, and you press check name, you will say, okay, I've got it, this is not valid. Okay, because SharePoint has no clue where you're coming from. SharePoint, and that's also the trust principle that I explained you, whatever is coming from ADFS, SharePoint will trust it. So if you type, this is not valid as a username, SharePoint will say, well, okay, whatever. If there is one day a this is not valid user coming from SharePoint, I will give him access. Because he doesn't know if you're coming from Active Directory or Oracle or some other directory. That's the first thing that you notice. Okay, you have this ADFS, it works, you can log in, and then you want to grant some rights. You go to permissions, people and groups. Okay, what is this? So this doesn't work, and also the address book functionality from the people picker doesn't work anymore. Whatever you type, it will say, okay, I found it, even if it doesn't not exist. So that's a bit of a pain. Now what you can do is implement a custom claims provider, and that's developer stuff. It's all very well documented. Luckily for us, for me, poor IT pros who can't open Visual Studio even, there are ready-made solutions available, like this one, ldapclaimsprovider.codeplex.com. That's one you can use. You deploy it as a full trust solution file, so okay, that's no problem. But because a solution file is dependent on the web server function, so the Microsoft SharePoint Foundation application that you see in services on server, it has to be activated on all servers in your farm. So some people deactivate this on application servers. If you want to use a custom claims provider, don't do this. Leave it active on all servers. Otherwise, the solution or the DLL won't get deployed to all your bin directories and all your servers, and you will probably need it. This custom claims provider can be used for two things. Name resolution, that's the people picker. So it has some methods. If you press check name, it will go out to Active Directory or to some other provider to check your credentials, not to see if your username exists. That is name resolution. And then you can also do augmentation. And augmentation is something special. Augmentations means that you can add additional claims that were not provided by ADFS. And because this is .NET code, you can do all kinds of interesting logic with it. You can say, okay, if the user has SP-admin in it, it's an admin user, so he gets an additional claim that it's an admin, for example. And then based on this claim admin, you can do You can give all users that have the admin claim full control permissions, for example. That's augmentation, but that's pretty advanced. So that's the custom claims provider. That's probably the first thing you want to do after you've implemented ADFS. And if you've implemented it, that this is not valid will be not valid, and he says we couldn't find an exact match. And all these error messages are configured inside of the custom claims provider. Something else is the username. This is also something I shamelessly borrowed from Victor, but he's not in the room. Yes. Okay. So your username will consist of all kinds of special characters. For example, your identity claim, your unique identifier, will also always begin with an I, the I from identity claim, and all kinds of special characters. And if you're using ADFS, it will be T. It will be T. And if you're using Windows claims, it will be W. You see, that's trusted and Windows claims. And then there is your username is created. That could be important to know if you're doing all kinds of custom code. You might have code that checks for a domain name / and strips it away, for example. Remember, that doesn't work anymore, so you have to do something with this convention to get your actual username out of it. And in my case, my actual username is this one. Okay. That's just for reference. In SharePoint 2013, you can change these. In 2010, that was not possible. For migration scenarios, that might be handy. Okay, this is the issue I already talked about. So what if you have multiple web applications, like my sites application? This is the command to modify SharePoint, so that SharePoint knows that there is another web application that is connected to ADFS, and afterwards you have to do the same thing to ADFS. I'll quickly show you how to do that. So basically what we are going to do here, we get a reference to the identity provider, and then we say, okay, add this URL of this web application to the web applications that are connected to ADFS. And that's my site's web application. And we add it, and we give it its own identifier. So not URN, SharePoint, SPS, STHLM, but with my sites appended to it. So if we now go to ADFS, we send this this identifying information in the request, and now we have to change ADFS to accept this, and then our second web application will work also. So we have to add another relying party trust, like we would do for the hostname site collections, and it has the exact same syntax. SPS, STHLM. Why did I make it so difficult? mysites.lab.phvo.net. Again with the underscore trust virtual directory. Oh yeah, okay. My mistake. Was too early. First display name, SPS, STHLM. My sites, that's the identifier. If you've got 1,000 sites, that might come in handy. We use ADFS, okay, no encryption certificates, and here's the URL of our web application. Just the same way that we did before. Okay, now it's critical to specify the right identifier. So it's this one. You better copy it, because you always make mistakes here. And then it takes a few hours to troubleshoot and to go through the ADFS logs. Okay, so we know that if there is a request for this realm, ADFS knows what to do. Next, 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 finish. It's still Microsoft, right? And then we add some claims, exactly the same as before. So we are going to send the same claims that we send to our portal web application. We're going to send that to our my site. I'm going a bit quicker now because we already did this before. AD rule. Everything is coming from Active Directory. We use our user principal name. That becomes the UPN claim. We use our Windows unqualified names. That becomes the role. And we use our email addresses. That becomes the email address. It takes the first one if you've got multiple email addresses. Okay. And now I will be probably punished because I type too fast. Let's see if it still works. Okay, so this is our portal application. And if we now go to our news feed, we will use the other web application, and we will send this information to ADFS, and ADFS will now know that it is a different web application to redirect the user to. And we should not arrive anymore at the portal web application. You see, we are at ADFS now. He's verifying. If it goes slow, by the way, that's probably a certificate that is checked. That's also one of the tips I want to give you. If you've got a timeout of about 30 seconds, it's always certificates. Okay, and now we have our My Sites application. So that works. So multiple web applications or hostname site collections have to be identified in ADFS too. That's more or less the same. So add a relying party and do the same PowerShell for every web application that you have. Another interesting one is cross-web application authentication. We recently had a customer who put all his pictures in one web application and put the portal in another web application and used ADFS. The problem is when you log on with ADFS, your domain, for example, SPS, HTLM, is stored in the cookie. And when you then try to get pictures that are physically in another web application, because you've not gone there yet, you don't have a cookie that corresponds to that domain where the pictures reside. And then you get this unknown picture thing. Unfortunately, there is no workaround for this out of the box. You could do all kinds of interesting stuff to have people redirected to all web applications underneath, etc., via an HTTP handler or something. But there are no really good solutions, so try to do everything in one web application and not use resources from another web application. For profile pictures, there is a fix, but it uses a special method, and to enable this, you have to use this PowerShell. So you say, okay, get my web application, and there's a property cross-domain photos enabled is true. That is always only for user profile pictures. You have to be creative if you have issues with other pictures. Remember when we set the authentication providers, there was a red error message. And the error message says that search cannot crawl ADFS authenticated web applications, because search only works with Windows. So there are a couple of possibilities. You could create a separate zone with Windows authentication just for search. That's possible. Or you could create some kind of logic in your SharePoint pages that sees, based on the request header, if it's search that is asking for something or a normal user, and then do some kind of redirects yourself. But I think probably having multiple zones is the most easy one. However, you have to be careful. If you don't crawl on the default zone, your security trimming might sometimes be a bit flaky. So if you are going to do the set up multiple zones route, it's probably better to have your default zone in Windows authentication and then your custom zone or your intranet zone in ADFS authentication. Before in SharePoint 2010, those were mainly labels, the zones, but now in 2013 they have a lot more real functionality, like this one. That's the cookie thing. So session cookies versus persistent cookies. The Office client only works with persistent cookies. And the problem with persistent cookies is that they're persistent. So if the timeout is 20 minutes, in a time frame of 20 minutes, you can still log on to SharePoint even after you close your browser and open it again. So that is, you can configure these sliding windows with this command. That's something I already told you. So if there is problems with some things being slow, you have to import the right certificates in all kinds of certificate stores, and then it goes much faster, especially when your servers are not connected to the internet. SharePoint hosted apps, you know those apps that live inside of, well, not inside of SharePoint, but are hosted by SharePoint, and they're JavaScript, they won't work with SAML. So that's important to know. Perhaps in the future, but not for the time being. So if you want to use apps, host them in Azure or use other provided hosted apps, but not the SharePoint hosted apps. They won't work. If your My Sites don't work anymore, you have to go to the user profile service and verify the claim user identifier. In my case, that should be user principal name, so that SharePoint can do the match between your user principal name, your unique identifier, and your username in the user profile service. That's also very common. Okay, and if you publish to the internet, make sure your URL of your ADFS server is identical on the internet and the internet. Okay, well, we'll skip that one. This is the home realm discovery. If you configure Windows authentication and SAML authentication on the same zone, this is the dialog box that you get, because ADFS does not know where you're coming from, so you have to choose this yourself. Am I an employee? Then I'm checked in this Active Directory. Am I a partner? Then I'm checked in the other Active Directory, for example. That's something ADFS can't do for you. There are all kinds of tricks that you can do. For example, verify the HTTP headers to see if you're coming from a reverse proxy server, then you're probably a partner, etc., and do this automatically, so the user doesn't have to make this choice. Also very common. If you want to troubleshoot, ULS Viewer and Fiddler, still our best friends. This is what we've done. So the key takeaways: custom claims provider, that's number one, absolutely. Multiple web apps and cookies, user profile service perhaps, and make sure that you know that ADFS is not only Active Directory, it can only also federate to other directories, and you're not limited to Active Directory. Okay, if we still have questions, we will take them afterwards because I've run a few minutes over time. So be sure to tap the right evaluation button, and if you still have questions, come to me afterwards and I'll be around the rest of the day. Thanks very much.